Pax and I were talking about this movie, and how ironic it would be if, upon reviewing with, full analysis mode on and really thinking about it and really analyzing it, how if my view would change completely, if this would become my least favorite rather than my worst, or most, excuse me. Because after all, time and circumstance can change many things, especially when you're really thinking about something as I usually refer to as my analysis mode, when I really turn that on. I went to see this movie, as I have seen many of the movies in the midnight showing, the only one I actually missed being A New Hope. I was actually still on pain meds at the time. It was very recently after my accident, when I basically lost the use of my leg, and I was only a week out of the wheelchair when the movie went out. I went on my crutches, actually. Got to sit in the best seat in the house because it was the one and only time I actually got to use the handicapped seating. Had my paperwork with me just in case someone tried to question me on it. Nobody did, for reference. The thing that amused me most in hindsight is I went with the crutches, and I was wearing this outfit, or rather I was wearing the full outfit, the full robe, the full cape. You haven't seen it, but I have bottoms as well. And my friends I was going with started calling me rather in mockery, Darth Crutch. I just share this because it amuses me, and I talked about this during my Halloween stream, the idea of things can become terrifying with the proper context. By the end of that night, I had actually managed to make such an intimidating presence with strategic use of my movements and the crutch that they were actually like, okay, dude, you're scaring us. But I digress. Yes, I loved the movie. It was still awesome. And I'm going to start talking about a few things why before we really get into individual details. Don't mistake. Episode 3 made many mistakes. Just about any truly great or amazing movie is still flawed. As I like to use as my penultimate example, even Final Fantasy VI is a flawed game. One of the things that I have a theory on, and it's funny because it's a theory in the sense that the facts that I'm about to present are true, and yet we don't know. I am only connecting the facts, if that makes any sense. My theory is the connection, not the facts themselves. George Lucas, and I'll talk about this more when we go into episode 4. George Lucas is a film geek, always has been, ever since he was young. For those of you who don't know, when I use the term geek, I mean that very much as a compliment. As I've defined many times, a geek is someone who has a genuine enthusiasm about what they care about, or whatever it is. It could be cars, it could be games, it could be literature, it could be music, it could be art. The subject doesn't matter to the definition of a geek. All that matters is you care about it, and you are genuinely enthusiastic about it, and this is the important part, you never step over that line into antagonizement for others. You never become a hate boy or a fanboy. That is the definition of a nerd, someone who will try to be objectional, argumentative, otherwise negatively impacting towards others because of their caring about whatever it is that they like. But a geek, that was definitely George. He was a huge fan of film history and film cinematography, and it's no wonder because he really wanted to throw something out there into the film history, into the archive, something that would make some kind of impact, have some kind of waves. He wanted to add to something he loved. And I think all of us could understand that, right? I mean, surely there's things out there that you are a geek of that, if given the opportunity, you would love to actually contribute to, as a whole, right? Lord knows I have that feeling. I'll talk about that specific thing about his creation and his invention of A New Hope a while ago, but the point that is significant for Revenge of the Sith is he did it and he succeeded, and then he got noticed because of it, and he got picked up by some other people who were basically meteorically rising stars at the time, Spielberg being a big one, and did some really great stuff, and he got his wish. George Lucas, I'm sorry, I know his name is kind of synonymous with bad directing and bad writing and a joke nowadays, and people mock the hell out of him, but I'm sorry, George Lucas contributed to cinema history in a good way, if I could be blunt. He truly added to the thing he loved. Why is this significant for Revenge of the Sith? Let's fast forward a bit. Next fact: Phantom Menace comes out. Financial success, critical mixed, but mostly failure. It was mostly a net negative by the critical acclaim. So George, who was, well, let's just say that George went into that thinking, I'm going to do it the right way. Now, this is something a lot of writers, creators in general, have a problem with, myself not being exception. It's basically an arrogance. It reaches the point where you think, I can do this, and therefore I'm going to do it without outside help, without external influence or stimuli. And so you do the thing, and it's not as good as it otherwise would have been. Now, I already talked about Episode 1, extensively, actually. But no matter how you look at it, even I still think that movie was kind of lacking in basically every way, and is so close to the negative line, it's debatable. So George took a few steps back. He said, okay, I'll let other people have more influence and work on this. I'll work with other directors, other producers. We'll do Episode 2, but I'm still maintaining control. I still want to be the one who writes my story. Episode 2, by contrast to Episode 1, bombed critically. Episode 1 was at least moderately well received. Episode 2 was almost universally panned. Now I'm going to present the facts here, really quick. Episode 3, George Lucas took an unprecedented level of backseat. He still wrote some of the work, he still did the overall thesis, he was still the primary director, but for the most part he let most of the other people who were involved with Lucasfilms and Star Wars in general take the foreground and go ahead and make the film that we made. And Star Wars Episode 3 was universally praised, and was a critical and financial success. Next fact, a few years pass, and he sells away the rights to his lifeblood to Disney. Now, when you look at the facts, it's probably obvious what my theory is. But let's really analyze this for a moment, because if I'm right, I actually have a degree of sympathy for this man. Although I think he went a little too far, and maybe I'm exaggerating, who knows, but I mean, we look at someone who really wanted to do something great and succeeded, and then kept doing great stuff for a while, and then he kind of took a back step because certain things forced him to do so. I know at least one of you is going to mention Howard the Duck, and there's actually a huge mess of a story behind that, which I'm not even going to go into right now. And then he's like, okay, I really want to return to Star Wars. I know I said I wasn't going to, but I've been wanting to continue that story for a long time. I want to tell my story of the prequels, of the fall of the Republic. Let's do this. And I've seen the behind-the-scenes footage of Phantom. I've seen all sorts of material and interviews and everything. It's pretty obvious at the time, George was genuinely enthusiastic about working on Phantom Menace. A lot of people were. It's obvious to think of why. We're working on a Star Wars film. Good or bad, it's hard to overcome that particular glow. Then he did Episode 2. And that was the other one he had a significant contribution to. The one that bombed. Then he finally let other people take the reins in Episode 3, and that was the success. How can you deny the conclusions that can be made from that? The slap to the face, almost. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with the possible conclusions that George Lucas himself came from this. Because after all, there's no shame, in my opinion, in being someone who could do good stuff in a group. And I've said this a trillion times, that is George Lucas in a nutshell. He works really well in a group. He does amazing stuff in a group. When he works by himself or when he takes control, we get Episode 1 and 2, and a few other things I could mention that I don't want to bring up right now. And then he sells it off. Now, I mentioned that sells it off thing because that's really the clincher. Really, when you think about it. George Lucas willingly selling off his baby, basically. Something that he created and helped create, helped found, helped add. And again, remember, calling back to that original thing, he added something to the culture of his geekdom, in this case, movies. He helped bring Star Wars into the world and helped add to filmography in general. I mean, Industrial Light and Magic is, to this day, the leading force behind special effects in that matter. And there's a good reason for that. And it's not just visual effects, but sound effects as well. They have been the top-notch designers of the editing and post-process for decades. He helped add that. For him to be willing to sell that means to me either one of three things. Number one, he decided, in a manner of humility, okay, I'm obviously past my time and can't add anything to this thing I love. I leave it to other people. Thing two, He was so ashamed of how much he failed and the sheer blunt force of his failure that he couldn't bring himself to touch that thing that he loved anymore. Or 3, and admittedly this is the most mundane one and the one I don't agree with at all, but I'm mentioning for the sake of completionist, he just wanted to retire. He just wanted the money. Very unlikely, given what I do know about George Lucas from his many, many things. And I just mentioned this because Star Wars Episode 3 really was, in my opinion, and is, since I literally just finished watching it, an amazing movie. I am not ashamed to admit that I actually cried on rewatching it just now, today, a few hours ago. Why is that, though? Why is this one the good one? I mean, I just mentioned, George took a backseat and let other people work on it. That is a huge contributor, and no one can deny that. And yet it's the first prequel that actually feels like a Star Wars movie. The overall tone and inflection is definitely more leaning towards Star Wars and less towards something that is not, basically. It's like the difference between, if I could be blunt, the good Extended Universe stuff and the bad Extended Universe stuff. Yes, all of it's Star Wars, but only the good stuff actually feels like Star Wars, captures that intent, that feeling of it. Like KOTOR captured the feeling and intent of a Star Wars game, without actually being, the original trilogy. It is something that can be done. And I could describe that overall feel and thematic significance and the difference between light and dark and all the different details that make up something that makes it feel Star Wars. But I'm going to focus on just one really quick. Anakin Skywalker. I've mentioned before, and I'll say it again, I feel like the entire prequel trilogy should have been Anakin Skywalker's story, and it kind of wasn't, except for this one. Episode 3 is, without question, Anakin Skywalker's story. It is all the events and all the significance of everything that happens in Episode 3 all revolves around him. It is all about everyone else in the reaction to him, how they affect his growth, and how they affect his change from Anakin Skywalker to Vader to Darth Vader. I'm only making the visual distinction to get across the point of when he's crippled and when he's not. And we seeing the full cycle of that growth and the beginning of the new era of darkness. It is also worth noting Episode 3 is definitely the darkest of the trilogy, and for good reason. After all, most works agree that the Galactic Civil War era, which is basically from here until Return of the Jedi, is the darkest period in Star Wars history, although there's some contention on that point, but I digress. Point being, the fact that it was finally Anakin's storyline, I think, is one of the biggest reasons why this one succeeded, whereas the other two didn't. Episode 1's focus was on... actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure there was a focus in Episode 1. Really. Episode 2's focus was a little bit more on setting and development of the setting, as it usually should be. I mentioned that back in my Episode 2 video. But Episode 3 was all about Anakin. And there's no denying that. Another thing, though, I'm at the moment here, there's some awesome change in the overall directorial style. I don't know how to describe change in direction. It's really weird to describe it, but literally watch the movie, especially just after watching Episode 1 and 2, the change in the visual direction and the audio direction is sudden and violently different. Much more harsh, much more military, much sharper angles, much more dread, much more dramatic potential behind it. You always, at every moment, get this feeling that things are horrible. Even the scenes where there is light and sky and there's this beautiful stuff, with like 2 exceptions, even those scenes feel like they are tainted by that same dread that affects the rest of the piece, which is on purpose and done well, to emphasize that things are going downhill quickly, and no matter how nice things look, they most assuredly are not. And I also want to feel like John Williams did a great job with this movie. Now, granted, this is John Williams, and I'm not sure he's ever not done a great job with something. But listen to the music of this movie sometime. Compare it especially to Episode 1 and 2's music. Episode 3's music is much more harsh, much more dark, and much more military than the previous two. And again, some of his songs, like the opera, or Padme's Rumination, the scene where the two of them are looking at each other across the cityscape, those songs really emphasize the direction John Williams was going with this musically. It really just low, quiet, and terrifying. It reminds me of the theme he came up with for Emperor Palpatine himself in Empire and fleshed out more in Return of the Jedi, but I digress. So let's start going down bit by bit here. General Grievous. I will discuss him in more length in a bit, but I want to mention right off the bat 2 things. Number 1, most people still agree he was pretty awesome, even just in the movie. Even ignoring the ancillary works where he is actually awesome. I'll talk about that, like I said, later. But it's just worth noting that they made a rather memorable and interesting villain, even for his relatively brief and kind of pathetic appearance in this one. It's also worth noting that this is another example of something done for the movie and then explained better in the books. His cough was originally designed, by George Lucas's own admittance, to be indicative of like a halfway in between, well, you know, a droid and what Vader would become. He was always supposed to be that kind of stepping stone into the more cybernetic, more flesh than machine kind of thing that Darth Vader himself would eventually become. And so the cough was literally just added so that the audience would know immediately that he was someone who actually did have organic parts. And if you're paying attention, and it is subtle, there's actually quite a few hints of that other than his eyes. You can actually see a few organs and blood vessels pulsing here or there as he shows them during scenes pretty early on and throughout the piece, well before his chest pieces open up and you can actually see his organ sac. Love the sight of the battle over Coruscant. Absolutely beautiful cinematography there. The design of the ships, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The cityscape down below. The fact that they're obviously so close in inner orbit that you can basically, I mean, you could feel like you could just fall and there's the cityscape down below. Obviously it's miles down, but you get the point. Wonderful and very beautiful, and really shows off the Clone Wars at its height. It's a good way to show that big screen appearance of this is what a battle in the Clone Wars is like. And another reason why there was I think that compromise was a good thing. Obviously they flesh out the Clone Wars war in other works, but we get to see what a battle of the Clone Wars is like on the big screen, which is awesome. Another thing they do really well is they show a bunch of new different ships. Some of the old ones, some new ones with similar design to the old ones. Some ones with similar designs to the ones we'll see in the original trilogy. The point being to get across that, not only that bridging period between the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, but also to emphasize that it has been years, in fact I believe 4 years, I could be wrong about that, but it has been at the very least years since episode 2. And we have this immediate thing between that and between the difference in the appearance between Obi-Wan and Anakin that we know it has been a bit, time has passed. It's a very good immediate visual indicator. At no point does someone say, and it has been several years since. No, they don't have to. This is a great example of show not tell, in other words. Anakin, this is again something that really is fleshed out in the Clone Wars series, but Anakin again shows his caring for his troops, even though they are just clones. His almost refusal, he does acquiesce, but his almost refusal to leave them behind and his desire to help them, and even though they're just clones, because they're his troops, it's very indicative of his personality, his mindset, and remember how I kept mentioning back in episode 2, watch Hayden Christensen's face? I'm going to be mentioning that a lot in this one too. Watch his face when Obi-Wan says, leave me behind. I'm done. You need to be dedicated to the mission. Blah blah blah. Very Obi-Wan, I might add, but also very Anakin. That not only Anakin refuses, but again, watch his face when he refuses. His absolute refusal of the possibility of leaving behind his brother is amazing, and a great way to start the movie, given the way it ends. But I'm moving ahead of myself. I also like the fact that there's some genuine humor in this, mostly between Obi-Wan and Anakin, which also brings me to my next point, which is amazing. The chemistry between Obi-Wan and Anakin in this movie is phenomenal. Every scene they have together just shines for me. It's kind of ironic, considering they have better chemistry than him and his wife, but there's no jokes here. That's just indicative of the writing and directing style on hand. And it's also indicative of the actors involved. Hayden Christensen and Ewan McGregor managed to make themselves feel like people who were basically brothers, blood brothers, bond brothers. And I'm sorry, when I say blood brothers, I don't mean they're related. I mean people who have shed blood together. That's what I usually mean when I say that. In other words, they have a bond that is stronger than mere blood relation. They have gone through so much together, and you can see that. And again, this is a great example of showing, not telling. They don't have to say, and we have become very close, haven't we, Obi-Wan? Why, yes, we have, Anakin. That would have been just terrible. Instead, they show it through their actions, reactions, the way they talk with each other, the way they joke with each other, the way they seem to anticipate each other's movements almost perfectly. That's another thing the choreography did really well, and is something I know was done on purpose, because I've looked into the behind-the-scenes stuff. Of course I have. I'm a geek. What do you want from me? But the choreography team always wanted to make it clear that the two of them were working basically as one solid unit. I'll touch on that more later. I really like, well, okay, brief aside here. Um, Droid rights is something I'm not sure I want to talk about in any of these ruminations because it's a massive issue that basically deserves its own video. I'm not sure I have the time to devote to a video just about droid rights. I'll discuss it briefly here because it is touched on several times in episode 3. And it's obvious that it was done on purpose, especially given the fact that the extended universe had already discussed the possibility and ramifications of droid rights. Here's the thing. A droid is not a sentient creature initially. However, over time, they do become what we would define as sentient. They gain individual personalities because their mentality, their programming, I should say, is designed to be very adaptive. And so they adapt to what's happening around them. And so the more experience they have, the more they grow into their own individual personality and their own individual sentience. So you could see why that's a sticky issue even at the beginning, because we are literally creating what is effectively babies, if you think about it. Because that defines a human being, doesn't it? Would you consider a newborn baby fully self-aware and sentient? No, of course not. But they have a mind that is very adaptive and very understanding and can morph and shape its own self and personality over years of experience, just like a droid can. And this is only the first of many reasons why this is such a sticky issue. The second reason, the second biggest reason, is droids can be mind wiped. When that happens, they're literally put back to factory status. All of their experience, all of their personality, all of everything is just wiped, and they go back as if they just came off the assembly line. In other words, they're put back into the state where they're basically just that baby. Think about the potential for that for a moment. This is almost used jokingly in the movie, although it is understandable why Organa does this to 3PO. But one of the interesting things is they make a point of showing that R2 is not wiped. And it is confirmed in the extended universe, I don't care what you say, it's still canon, that R2 was never mind-wiped, which is one of the reasons why he had such a unique personality in the original trilogy. Yes, I know this is retconning, but it still makes sense, so I'm okay with it. And it also shows how R2 stayed with the rebellion, and with Leia in particular, and managed to, shall we say, be perfectly poised to help events many, many times. I mean, granted, some of this is theory crafting, but it does fit the facts pretty much perfectly, so. I only mention it in brief, though, because in general, droids are treated by most everyone involved as if they're not even people. One of the very few exceptions here is Anakin, who obviously actually cares about R2, and has refused to allow R2 to be mind-wiped, even though that is standard procedure extensively. Like, he has refused for years. By contrast, Obi-Wan's R4, which is the same R4 from Episode 2, has been mind-wiped, I think, at least twice? I forget, but either way. It just shows that differing perspective, and again, Anakin's caring about people, but that's going to be mentioned throughout this movie, because it's hammered into us over and over, which is good, because this is his story. Insert Titus joke here. Obi-Wan was taken out of the fight against Dooku pretty quickly and pretty brutally, and that always bugged me the very first time I saw it, until I started thinking about it. Even the book doesn't actually flesh this out. Oh, I'm sorry, really quick. I'll be mentioning the Revenge of the Sith book extensively, partially because most of what it added to the story is considered canon, and by which I mean all of it that it added to the story is considered canon, but also because it really fleshes out certain scenes in ways that the movies basically couldn't, or didn't, depending on how you define that. Regardless, even the book does not flesh out this scene in the way I imagined, but one of the interesting things is I always had a theory that Palpatine was actually using his power to basically keep Obi-Wan down. It wouldn't take much, just a little influence to make sure he stays unconscious, so that he couldn't interfere in this scene. And especially given that Palpatine was so willing to leave him behind, well, you know. So Anakin and Dooku duel, and then Dooku is destroyed. One of the interesting things that I've heard some people say this is a cinematic cheat. I disagree. Several times and in several points in this movie, we see Palpatine still behaving as if he is Palpatine, the kindly senator, even when no one is viewing him, even when there's no one for him to be portraying to, no one for him to be acting to, no audience. And it's considered a cinematic cheat because most of the time, when a movie maker does that, they do that specifically to lie to the audience to maintain a twist or whatnot. But I don't think that's what's being done here. I think this is more of Palpatine's mindset in a nutshell. I'll be talking about Palpatine a lot this movie too, because he is the other major character in this piece. Um, I think it's more his mentality that he maintains his own persona, his own, that kindly thing so well and so hard that it doesn't occur to him to turn it off or not do it, even when he's alone, if you know what I mean. Even when he is by himself, even when he is in private, he is still maintaining that facade. It's also worth noting that the first time, debatably ever, that he has ever actually broken his facade is with Anakin. It's funny because what he does is he says, "Oh, good, good, Anakin," and there's this obvious relief, and then he says, "Kill him. Kill him now." It's beautiful acting on the part of Ian McDiarmid. If I can digress for just a moment. I don't remember if I talked about this before, because it's actually been a couple days since I did the episode 2 video. I'm sorry, my nose itches as ever. Ian McDiarmid specifically acted Sidious and Palpatine as two totally separate characters. Now, you may look at that kind of weird, but understand what that means from the actor's perspective. And it wasn't done to cheat. Ian McDiarmid's own opinion was that Palpatine's mind was so powerful, so disciplined, and so compartmentalized that for all intents and purposes, he was a different character when he was Palpatine, and he was a different character when he was Sidious. Now, keep in mind, I am not trying to intimate or imply that this is a Tyler Durden situation. I'm just saying that his control was so great that he could effectively change the positioning of the mirrors of his mind such that you see a completely different image based on who he's talking to. I mention this because Ian McDiarmid had to really stretch his acting talents in this movie because he had to play 3 roles in this movie. He had to play Sidious, he had to play Palpatine, and he had to play Palpatine allowing Sidious to show through, but not all the way. It was basically a hybrid between the two. So listen to the way he says the lines. It's so subtle. He's like, "Oh," and he's just, "Yes," and he's still the kindly, Palpatine. And then his tone changes ever so slightly when he says that line, "Kill him. Kill him now." The way he says that line is just a tiny bit different because he's allowing his Sidious facade to peek through. And yes, I said facade. I'll get to that in a minute. He's allowing that to peek through. And then he allows himself to go full Sidious for exactly one line. He just says, "Do it," in reference to executing Dooku. And then he immediately switches back to Palpatine for the duration, for the remainder of the scene, actually. And it's just brilliant, brilliant acting. I love it. One other line I want to mention here really quick. One of the other things that I can show as a sign of George Lucas kind of learning his ways is that one of the things I've mentioned a lot on my Voyager videos is how after a certain point in time, an actor will have a certain amount of creative say in their character. This is a typical thing in Hollywood and has been for years upon years. There's no hard and set rules as to when and how you gain those rights. But the general impression is always that you have to earn it. Christopher Lee insisted that the scene be changed in its portrayal because from its original scripted version because he believed he had a different interpretation of Dooku, and George Lucas actually agreed with him. Originally, Dooku was going to beg for his life and portray himself, shall we say, cowardly, and Christopher Lee said, "That's not my character," and discussed it with George, and George says, "You're right. I'm sorry," and changed the script to suit it. So instead we see Christopher Lee portraying a character who has been betrayed, but it's his shock and his disbelief at the moment, but at no point in time does he try to beg for his life or yield. It's just he realizes, and you can tell on his face, he realizes he has been outmaneuvered. He has been a tool who has been used and is now being disposed of, and he knows it. And that is very Count Dooku. So then we move forward a bit. Palpatine mentions almost idly the fact that Anakin killed the Sand People, however many years ago. I mention this because I mentioned back in my episode 2 video that there would be very few people Anakin would actually feel comfortable enough to mention something so personal and so that he was so ashamed of too. And one of the people on that list of 3 was Palpatine, and hey, shocked if I wasn't right. But it is, again, very indicative of something I'll be talking about much more later, the trust and friendship between the two. 2 things. First of all, I love the Magna Guards. They're cool. I kind of wish we saw more of them. They remind me a lot of IG-88, actually. I love the Magna staves they use. That's a cool weapon, and it's a great concept having the electric repulsor on the ends of the staff to be able to repulse lightsabers, that kind of thing. I also love the fact that Obi-Wan beheads one, and then it just kind of keeps coming at him, and Obi-Wan's like, oh, well, okay. Because most of the time you chop off the head and a droid stops, so that was also pretty cool. Just felt like mentioning it. You can tell I read Darth and Droids because of the quote I'm about to say. I've also mentioned the comic before. Air is for suckers. Grievous is interesting because in this one scene, I'm going to talk about this more later, but in this one scene we see someone who actually is an interesting opponent for the Jedi. He is quick, strong, obviously more sophisticated than most droids, obviously has more of a personality than most droids. Even if we don't realize he is cybernetic yet, cyborg-netic, in other words, he's a hybrid, we still realize that this is someone who is more than just a mere droid, and that's awesome. Hang on, my paranoia's hitting me really quick. I'm pretty sure I hit record. Every now and again, I have not hit record. I don't want to sit here and talk for 2 hours without, so I'm just going to check this really quick. Okay, I did hit record. We're good, we're good. Sorry about the interruption. So he, and not only that, but he makes this tactical escape. Now, as some people will point out, Grievous is in the movies depicted as cowardly and constantly escaping. I'll talk about that more later. But this one escape is okay. The way he does it is awesome and indicates his own willingness to think outside the box and his ability to do things that the Jedi basically can't. Knocking out the shield, flying out into space, walking on the surface of his ship to an escape pod. That's very awesome, actually. And a lot of people were really excited to see more of Grievous in the movie. Cough, cough. Next point. Jar Jar has one line in this movie, and it is, "Excuse me," and that's it. Trust me, I was paying attention. If he says anything else, I missed it. Granted, I was getting kind of emotional during this movie, because like I said, holy crap, but anyways. So I mentioned way back in episode 1 that there were 3 scenes between Padme, Twitface, and Anakin that were actually really, really good. One of them was the one in episode 2. I assumed one of them was in episode 1. I assumed one of them was in episode 2, and I knew one of them was in episode 3. I was actually wrong. The one I assumed was in 2 is actually here in 3. It's one of the next scenes. It's the scene where Anakin and Padme are meeting for the first time in God knows how long, and she reveals to him that she's pregnant. This is a beautiful scene, very well done. The lines are actually good for once, and the portrayal is amazing. The way she says something wonderful has happened, but she says those words with hesitation, with nervousness, with an uncertainty about the future, and his expression as he shifts through his own emotions. He has that shock, he has that happiness, he has uncertainty, he has fear, he has joy. It just plays out. This, again, Hayden Christensen's face, it plays out on his expression as he processes the fact that he's about to be a father and how much that means to him. And then she's like, oh my god, what am I going to do? And there's so much nervousness. And it's all exactly what it should be from the prospect of a new child. It was perfect. And his final line is just as well. This is a happy moment. Love that. Really do. So, yes, I'm going to now segue for a bit. Forgive me. Once upon a time, there was an online organization known as the Emperor's Hammer. It was a group of people who really liked a game called TIE Fighter, which was an awesome game that is now available on Good Old Games for only $10. You should buy it now. Anyways, please give me a I don't even know what they're called. Whatever. Sponsorship? No. We mostly played TIE Fighter for fun and kicks. We had a mission editor. We came up with our own missions. You would submit them. You could get promoted and all that fun stuff. It was a lot of fun. We also had a bunch of side groups in there. Some people who played Dark Forces in a similar manner. Some people who played Rebellion in a similar manner, etc., etc. One of the ones that we came up with, though, was called the Imperial Senate. And it was, in lore, it was a bunch of senators, representatives, I should say, from the various worlds that the Emperor's Hammer had conquered, who were allowed to basically collate and indicate policy well within the reins of imperial law, of course. And so, sometimes I wonder if the Emperor's Hammer is still around. Anyways, this is a while ago, obviously, because this was back around before Episode 1 came out, and indeed, when Episode 1 came out, which is why I bring it up now. one of the things that the Senate did in reality was we would debate. We would just theory craft and speculate, and we would actually hold debates where, you would have the floor, just like Debate Club back in the day. And so we were debating several interesting issues, and one of them was, is Emperor Palpatine from the original trilogy the same person as Senator Palpatine, or is it the same person as Darth Sidious? What is the identity of these three individuals? Now, we know now that it's all the same person, but it's probably obvious, especially in hindsight, why that debate existed. And again, I mentioned earlier, Ian McDiarmid's total different portrayal of the two characters really helped to highlight that. Now, I'll mention why I'm bringing this up in a second. I just want to share this story. I was on the side that I believed Palpatine was Sidious, and there was lots of reasons for that. Emperor Palpatine was Sidious. But the funny thing was, of all the reasons why I mentioned that, the funniest thing about it to me was that I, who was on that side of the debate me team, already knew how our side could lose the debate, and I mentioned it freely in our private forum as we were actively in the debate. It was actually an IRC debate thing, and so we had a private channel just for our side, and I was telling them, if they bring up either of these two arguments, they're going to win. And everyone else in the room agreed with me, and the other side, well, let's just say they didn't debate very well. I never actually lost any of those debates. Anyways, point being, here's the two big debates that could be levied on it. Both of them are kind of related. Number one, Palpatine is not Sidious because one is a clone of the other. Keep in mind, this was back before Episode 2 came out, but we already knew the Clone Wars were going to be a part of the prequels. And so one of the vague connections many people, myself included, came up with in theory crafting was the Clone Wars would be started by a clone and involve cloning of other significant individuals. And if you could clone someone who could still use the Force, as indeed was the theoretical case of Palpatine and Sidious, well, you see where that goes. This would actually explain, because it's funny, because in hindsight, this would explain a lot of what happened between Palpatine and Sidious and why the two were basically unconnected, and possibly explain away some of Sidious's control over Palpatine, thanks to their own self-cloning, etc., blah, blah, blah. But then we move on to the other theory, which was basically that Palpatine, whether he was a clone or a brother or just someone who was similar to Sidious, put it to you this way. Emperor Palpatine from the original trilogy is the same person as Sidious, but not Senator Palpatine. In other words, whether he is a clone or someone else, he is someone who usurps and replaces Senator Palpatine and then Chancellor Palpatine, and then becomes Emperor Palpatine in his place. Just some interesting food for thought. I mention it here because this movie finally settled that debate. Some people have asked me why it is they bother to do the reveal shot of Sidious, which is very well done from a cinematographic perspective, by the way. They have him, and it's the same shot it always is of Sidious, only showing his chin, and then the camera zooms in, and they actually have different lighting set up to slowly start lighting up his face, so as the camera zooms in, you can actually see his face being revealed, even though logically that's not how that should be happening, and you can actually fully see Palpatine's face underneath the cowl. Very well done job. But why do that reveal? Because the thing, and that's why I'm asked so often, everyone knows that's Palpatine. Well, but we didn't, and that's the beautiful part. The purpose in that reveal was to show us definitively that it is Palpatine, but it was very much in question up to that point, especially since by that point in time, clones were a factual thing, and we saw the kind of things clones could pull off, so interesting food for thought. Then I have a note here on my thing that says, insert more bad romantic dialogue. I think I've covered enough why that's bad in Episode 2. Let's just move on. Another interesting thing they mention, and this is another great example of showing, not telling. Grievous himself and Anakin's hand are both examples of the research into I can never think of the actual proper term, but in other words, cybernetic enhancements of organism and biological flesh. It's both indicative of the kind of things that were being really researched into at this time. It's mentioned, though, because it's debatable if there was foresight on the matter. Most people agree that there was not, that Palpatine did not deliberately start this because he knew Anakin would be crippled. It's more likely that they were researching into this in general at this point in time, and the result was beings like Grievous or the sophisticated hand that Anakin had, and that happened to be beneficial for when they had to rebuild Vader from what was left of him. So, food for thought. Here's another theory for you. One we don't actually know to this day. Was Anakin actually prophesying about the future when he was dreaming about the death of Padme? Which is possible. Or were his dreams and prophecies being influenced by direct and deliberate manipulation by Palpatine in order to dream of those things, in order to make them come to pass? Also possible. Just some food for thought. And then there is Yoda's failure. I'll be mentioning the failure of the Jedi at different points here, but this is Yoda's failure, and the moment which he truly basically lost this conflict. Yoda... Okay, Anakin has his dream. He goes to Yoda first, and then immediately afterwards he goes to Palpatine. I'll mention the symmetry of those when I talk about the second scene, but the point is, he goes to Yoda, and Yoda gives him no literal aid, no actual advice to follow. He doesn't actually speak to the moment of the situation. This is Yoda's failure right here. Yoda never adapted in the prequels and in all the time before. I'll talk about this more extensively later. But that is what he did wrong. He assumed that Path A would always work, and so he always preached, Path A. Well, I have this problem. Path A. Well, I have this totally different problem. Path A. And so all he tells Anakin to do is the same thing he tells everyone else to do. And it's obvious that he doesn't show the kind of caring and respect for that individual circumstance and that person that he is trying to help that was needed. I'll talk about that more later, too. Then we're going to do a couple more comments over here, and then we'll talk about the Palpatine side of that argument. So, then we have Palpatine appointing Anakin to the Council, which is one of the most brilliant and beautiful moves he could have ever done. Here's the thing. In so doing it, assuming everything goes well, he now has Anakin on the council and a part of council politics, which will help him with his things. But, of course, he knows they're not just going to accept that. But he knows they are going to accept it, period. Or at least partially, because he knows the council doesn't trust him any more than they trust just about anyone else in such political power as he is. He has deliberately allowed himself to appear more powerful recently, specifically so the council will trust him less. You know, more emergency powers, etc., etc. And so he knows they will accept Anakin's promotion to the council, specifically so they can then use Anakin as a counter-spy against him. And he, of course, informs Anakin that he needs him to be in there because he doesn't trust the council. I'll talk more about this later, but the truth of what Palpatine is saying is brilliant, because he maneuvers everyone into position, and everyone just follows as if they're following a script. Because what happens next? Well, they refuse to name him a master. Well, of course they do, because they didn't actually name him a master. And he knows that will upset Anakin and will affect his opinion of them, of the council, and the council's opinion of Anakin. And then he does the thing where the politics of it, the seeds of doubt he sows, are wonderful. And in so doing, he also prods the situation such that he knows Anakin, who is now a valuable asset to the council against Palpatine, will not be sent against Grievous. Why? Because Palpatine recommended he be sent against Grievous, and they're automatically going to disagree with his recommendation. Poor Obi-Wan. Poor Obi-Wan. His portrayal in the scene after that council meeting is perfect. Ewan McGregor's portrayal of the scene. He obviously disagrees with the council violently. He obviously hates the position he's in. And Anakin actually turns it on him and says, "How could you do this to me?" And Obi-Wan, in fact, I actually wrote this down. "Why are you asking this of me?" And Obi-Wan just pauses for a moment, and before he answers, "The council is asking this of you." And at several points, Obi-Wan says, "I agree with you. I am on your side." And it emphasizes again several wonderful little subtleties about the relationship between these two men and about Obi-Wan the character in general and his own disagreement with the way the council's been doing things lately. And that'll be significant again later. Poor Anakin. Throughout this movie especially, but in the book as well, it really emphasizes the way his confusion and uncertainty and lack of he has no idea what to do, basically, and it becomes more and more obvious as the movie and the book go on. And it's pretty obvious, especially given the book, that this was another deliberate thing that was being done. Palpatine basically, if you can picture a wet, thick blanket slowly being lowered onto someone and just drowning them and dampening them, and to the point where they can't move or see or think, and they have no idea what's going on. You just get this picture that he's getting more and more distraught, more and more frustrated, has no idea what's going on, and it's just building and building and building. Not at the payoff just yet. Because then there's the opera scene. And the opera scene emphasizes so beautifully the difference between Palpatine and the Council. Both are using Anakin. They are. Palpatine wants his perfect apprentice, his eternal apprentice. Remember, Palpatine doesn't really agree with the rule of two. He wants to always rule, and he wants someone powerful to always enforce, and the two to be in a perfect symbiosis, to be in perfect balance with each other. Yes, Palpatine knew Anakin would eventually turn on him, and that's very much emphasized in the books, but the point is that was his ideal. And the Council wanted Anakin to be the fulfiller of the prophecy, the one who would bring balance to the Force. I mean, after all, that's pretty much the only reason the Council ever agreed to let him be trained in the first place, remember? And Palpatine's usage of his words is perfect. At no point does he say, "The Jedi Council are plotting against me." He says, "I have suspected." He says, I am considering. He exaggerates slightly, but at no point in time did he actually flat out and say it. He just says he is worried. He's concerned about what the Council may be plotting to do. And the fact that he knows the Council has just asked Anakin to spy on him, he immediately turns and twists the knife right back into Anakin to further those seeds of doubt, confusion, anxiety, etc. Wouldn't it be ironic if the Jedi, the so-called bringers of peace and order and light and comfort and caring and compassion, had actually approached Anakin Skywalker, the kid, even if he was a teenager, or even if he was a boy, I say, but teenager would be even better, of course. Wouldn't it be amazing if they had approached him like he was family? If they had actually approached him like he was someone they cared about, if they bothered to show what they actually care about. Anakin himself says, the Sith are inherently selfish. They look only for themselves, but Jedi are inherently compassionate. They take care of others. And yet at no point has anyone in the Jedi Order, with the sole exception of Obi-Wan, the rebel, basically, has actually treated Anakin like he is anything other than a thing. Because that's how the Jedi Order works. That's how the Council has always worked, is trying to treat people distantly and detachedly, because they're so goddamned afraid of what could possibly happen if they actually bother to care about someone else on a personal level. And yes, it can go bad. But they're so afraid of that, they go so far in the opposite direction that the Jedi Council does more to push Anakin to the dark side than Palpatine ever did, and he knew that. Why do you think he was so damned friendly with him all these years? Why do you think he cultivated an actual relationship, a trust, a consideration with him? Why do you think Palpatine was the one person of three that Anakin actually trusted and cared about and was felt comfortable enough around to actually tell the truth to and actually be himself around? It's because Palpatine treated him like he was family. His usage of the way he says his words to Anakin in that beautiful opera scene, love the music in that scene, is so significant. If you literally watch the scene between Anakin and Yoda right before it, I actually rewound a bit, rewatched the Anakin and Yoda scene, and then went straight to the Palpatine and Anakin scene. It's wonderfully contrasting, because Yoda has his platitudes and talks about unnatural powers and all that fun stuff, and then Palpatine says some would consider this unnatural. His counterpoint to every one of Yoda's points is perfect and makes perfect sense. Now I'm going to pause for a moment to geek out about something totally different. Kashyyyk. For those of you who don't know, Kashyyyk is layers upon layers of death, basically. And I quote, each lower biome being worse than the one above it. The one and only view we ever have in the movies of Kashyyyk is of a beach, which looks kind of like, well, New Zealand, actually. But I've seen beaches like that myself on the California coast. Was a little disappointed by that. But seeing the Wookiees in action was awesome, so I'm willing to let it slide. Let's talk about Grievous now. I'm going to talk about Palpatine a little bit more in a bit, but even though the scenes go Kashyyyk, Palpatine, Obi-Wan, Grievous, Palpatine, I want to talk about Grievous and Obi-Wan first, so this makes more sense from the video's perspective. I mentioned earlier that Obi-Wan practices Niman lightsaber style. For those of you who don't know, that's basically the most fundamental, basic form of lightsaber combat. The book really emphasizes this. One of the reasons they send Obi-Wan rather than anyone else who is more skilled or more strong, whatever, is because of his mentality that I mentioned back in the episode 2 video. And Niman and his uses of that is perfectly indicative of that, because Ataru is all designed around making up for your failure, your weakness in size or strength or whatever, to make up for it with the maneuverability. Vapid, or Vapad, or Vapid, I really don't know how to pronounce that, is all about trying to use your own weakness, aka your lack of self-control, your usage of the dark side, etc., as a strength. Niman is just a style where you just use your strength. There is nothing it tries to make up for. No deficiency and no weakness that it accommodates for. Obi-Wan is sent because he knows himself and knows his own flaws, but at no point do his flaws actually hinder his ability to do. It has been argued that he is the only Jedi who is like that, and that's pretty much one of the hallmarks that truly makes him Obi-Wan Kenobi, because he is simply the Jedi. Flawed, yes, but at no point do his flaws or weaknesses actually impair him at all. Food for thought. General Grievous. Let's talk about him, because this is the only time I really have a chance to do so, because then he fights Obi-Wan and dies. The end. General Grievous was a Kalish. He was a Kalish general, actually, but I'm going to go really quick over this. I'm going to kind of summarize his story, but suffice it to say, he is fleshed out a lot in the books and in the series. He was a Kalish who basically had a pretty bad scenario, lost his mate, lost his friends, nearly died, under a circumstance that was framed on the Jedi and then was rebuilt by the Banker clan guy, whose name I can't think of right now, into the droid we all know as Grievous, soon to be General Grievous. He was a wonderful, interesting character because there was still enough of his personality and mindset underneath that. His rage, his discipline, his strength, his tactical capacity, his disdain for anybody who did not have his respect, and his loyalty to those who had it. And amidst all of that, he also had basically a computer brain slaved to his real brain that enabled him to do things that were otherwise impossible, like, wield 5 lightsabers at once. Now I know what you're thinking. What, 5 at once? Yeah, in things that aren't the movie, he could actually wield one in his foot as well, because he had a little bit of an anti-grav unit, a temporary one, installed in him as well. He was a death machine, in other words. He was basically a perfect death machine. The books also flesh out that cough I mentioned earlier, that I told you I'd get back to this. The intimation is that when he was fighting Mace Windu, and yes, he actually survived and held his own against Mace Windu, think about that, when he was trying to capture and kidnap Chancellor Palpatine, he, which is funny because he was there under orders from Sidious, just think about it for a moment. He succeeded in that fight, but he kind of lost, and Windu injured him in such a way that his breathing apparatus was basically permanently damaged. And it's very likely Grievous was on borrowed time, no matter how you look at it, because of his deteriorating organic state underneath the shell. But ignoring that, during the height of the Clone Wars, he was death-walking. He was incredibly good at tactics and strategy. Now, the thing is, he treated his droids as if they were less than dirt. He hated his droids, and he also hated being compared to the droids. At any point in time, if you dared to call him a droid, you'd be lucky to survive that. The very few people, in fact, actually I can only think of 2 off the top of my head, forgive me if this is incorrect, but the only 2 people that I can remember that actually earned his respect and therefore loyalty were Lord Tyrannus and Lord Sidious. Tyrannus, that is to say Dooku, of course, training him in his own form of Jedi fighting style, which, if you remember back in episode 2 video, I mentioned was specifically a style designed to fight other Jedi, which is rather appropriate, and one of the reasons why Grievous, a cybernetic organism, could stand up and basically defeat not only Jedi, but multiple Jedi at the same time. He was damned good at what he did. But the other thing that was interesting about Grievous is he is, in many ways, a sympathetic character. Someone who is not just reduced to a mere shred of his previous self, but someone who is basically, and there's no nice way to say this, mind raped when he was nearly killed and then reprocessed, because they didn't just slave him to a computer brain to ensure his loyalty, although they did do that. They also ensured that certain of his memories and emotions were kind of rewired underneath the face. So, for all intents and purposes, Grievous is basically an entirely different person than his original Kalish self, which I'm not even going to name because it's not relevant to this discussion. So he's a very sympathetic character because he is basically a victim in all this. And again, he is a wonderful counterpoint to not only Darth Maul, but Count Dooku. He is basically a blur of the two. The leader, the general, the tactician, who also happens to be an incredible fighter and capable of holding his own against many things. He was another one of those perfect puzzle pieces, just like Dooku was. And just like Dooku was designed specifically to be disposed of when it was done. And so you kind of feel for the man, or what used to be the man. Now that being said, there's a word here that I have written down that's called disappointment. All of the awesomeness of Grievous is in the extended universe, the books, the show. We basically don't get to see how incredible Grievous is in the movie. If I were to take a step back and just review the movie, I would be complaining this entire time about how they have this potentially interesting character who they do nothing with. He shows up, pontificates, yells at a few people, and then he pulls out 4 arms and 4 lightsabers, and it's like, yeah! And then he's an idiot with them and loses. The end. I don't understand why they did that, and I mean this sincerely. I understand Obi-Wan had to win that fight, and I'm actually okay with that. I agree with what I said earlier, that he is the one true Jedi and the one person who is best fitted to defeat someone like Grievous. But why not have him earn that victory rather than Grievous just not using his abilities to his full potential at all? This is a freaking movie. If there's any point in time at which you want to show the big budget, flashy, oh my god, this is amazing fight scene, choreography, effects, it's in a movie. But all they have is Grievous do a couple quick things, and it's a very, very short period of time before he's back down to 2 lightsabers, and then the battle begins, and then he runs, and then he fights without lightsabers, and it's just disappointing. And then he dies. Very uncivilized. And there's anything else I want to talk about before I get into the Palpatine thing? The Palpatine thing, the Palpatine thing. Wow, yeah, no, okay. Palpatine's manipulations and machinations just before the Grievous scenes were perfect. It was the perfect maneuver. Palpatine is not an idiot, and he is basically the closest confidant that Anakin has and knows him arguably better than anyone else does. So there's no denying that he knew there was one and only person that could really help save Anakin in this time of confusion and doubt and uncertainty. And that's Obi-Wan Kenobi, not Padme. She doesn't understand enough about what's going on, and the relationship between her and Anakin is different than the relationship between Obi-Wan and Anakin. And so Obi-Wan is the one, as I mentioned earlier, who was basically manipulated under the circumstances to be the one to go after Grievous. And again, isn't this so beautifully ironic? I mentioned before, the Jedi lost by going to war at all. Grievous was always a trap. But Grievous was a trap in this circumstance specifically for Obi-Wan. Because the one thing Palpatine needed was Obi-Wan to leave. As soon as Obi-Wan left that planet, Palpatine had won. As of that moment, all the pieces had been moved. He had just moved his queen over into this spot, I don't know, C-12 maybe, and it was now checkmate. It was over. There was nothing more to be done. The good guys had lost the moment Obi-Wan left that planet. And it's such a piteous shame, because the way Obi-Wan leaves, he parts with under such good circumstance with Anakin, and reassurement and concern, and the two care about each other. Think about the next time they'll see each other for a moment. The best part about Palpatine's plot, for me, is that for all his manipulations, his lies, his deceptions, the thing he does most beautifully is he tells the truth. And he exonerates trust. He actually shows genuine trust in Anakin. He could have manipulated the situation in such a way so that Anakin had no choice. Or he could have made it so that he could have defeated Anakin in battle. It is entirely possible to literally defeat a Jedi and have them turn to the dark side. But no. No, Palpatine turned Anakin to the dark side. Turned him to him by treating him like he cared about him. By being honest with him. By being open with him. Palpatine turns his back to Anakin as Anakin has a lightsaber to him. Picture the trust it requires for someone as manipulative and as devious as Palpatine to do something like that. And now it is time for me to really discuss something that's going to make all my viewers hate me. I'd love to hear your feedback on this, though, truly. I think Palpatine was a gray Jedi. One of the things he said in this movie reminded me of this. I've had this theory for a while, but I actually forgot this line. I wrote it down. If one is to understand this great mystery, one must study all its aspects, not just the dogmatic, narrow view of the Jedi. I tend to agree with that statement. Think for a moment, though. Think about the kind of personality and mindset Palpatine has, his willingness to do what is necessary to accomplish things, his lack of shame, his lack of pride, his incredible mental discipline, and his ridiculous control of the Force. I have argued that Palpatine is the strongest Force user in the entirety of the setting ever, but it is worth noting that is actually not accurate. He is not the strongest in raw power, but I still argue he is the one who can best use that strength in overall, like, if we were to categorize everything, not just raw strength, he would be the most powerful because of his ridiculous skill and control in using that awesome amount of power he has access to. Anakin is undoubtedly stronger than him, at least before the incident, and it is debatable that Darth Vitae, or however you say his name, the previous Sith Emperor, was also more raw, powerful than him. But neither of those individuals had the level of skill, discipline, strength, tenacity, intelligence, genius that Palpatine had. This is a man who has managed to be one of the single greatest Nexi of Darkseid in the galaxy, a few miles from the Jedi Temple. This is someone who has been so trusted and respected amongst the Jedi up until the later parts of the war, when he specifically wanted them to mistrust him, when he specifically wanted them to try and start working against him for the sake of his manipulations against Anakin, that they actually considered him someone they could use as an advisor, someone they trusted enough to tell things they wouldn't tell anyone else. Remember, I mentioned Yoda actually goes to Palpatine and the Council and says, I'm doing this, because Palpatine has engendered that level of trust amongst Yoda, for God's sakes. This is a man who has exhibited self-discipline to a point that would make Data jealous. Or Spock, actually, might be a better example, but the point remains. Now think about the difference between the light side and the dark side. The dark side is all about passion, aggression, and change. The light side is all about discipline, calm, peace, tranquility, and acceptance. Is it not logical to assume that Palpatine uses the light side just as expertly as he does the dark? Isn't it logical that he has been using the light side for so much of his career as the Chancellor? And that is how he still has his strength in the Force. That is how he still has the ability to do the things he does, to train Maul and to train Dooku and to turn various other people to a more obvious point of the dark side. Is it not logical that that is why he has been able to be within a few feet of multiple Jedi Masters and remain completely cloaked from their presence? Because again, that is the light side personified, is that tranquility. You never notice the light side's existence if it is in perfect harmony with its surroundings, which is what the light side is basically all about. And again, that kind of raw discipline is required to use the dark side extensively without it going too far, without being corrupted by it, and to use the light side extensively without being corrupted by it in the opposite direction. I postulate, and have had this theory for years upon years, that Palpatine is one of the best, not the best, but one of the best examples of a true Grey Jedi. And it fits his personality so well. I mean, why wouldn't he use the light side, you know? But I digress. I mentioned earlier there are 3 scenes between Padme and Anakin. And this is the third. This is actually my favorite scene in all of the prequel trilogies. There's a beautifully, quietly horrifying song playing in the background. Eerie, even. And just look it up sometime. Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, Padme's Rumination, I believe is the name of the song. And listen to it. Just brief. It's only like a minute and a half long. There's no dialogue. on her face, we see everything that is going through her mind. And she is in her apartment, and she looks across the scene, and the camera actually shows a slow pan of her viewpoint as we see the Jedi Temple way in the distance. Then it cuts to him, and he's in the council chambers, knowing that Mace Windu is going after Palpatine, knowing that Palpatine's death may mean the death of Padme, and the loss of his ability to learn anything outside of the dogmatic view of the council, which is true. And is also true that the Council will never help him with such a thing, as Yoda already wonderfully personified. But at the same time, he has his own loyalty and commitment, not just to the Order, but to the things the Order personifies. Because the Order are not evil. They're just wrong. They are so mired and stuck in their own viewpoint, they can't see 5 feet in front of their face without thinking that they should just, to go back to my earlier analogy, go on path A. And it's so beautiful because it also shows the difference between the two of them. It shows on her face all her fears and worries and anxieties about the future, about her career, about his career, about their children. But in the end, you see hope on her face. But then it cuts back to him, and his expression is amazing. And you can see him crumbling emotionally as he realizes, and he faces his fears, and as the dark side is consuming him alive. And he starts to cry because he can't take it. He cannot bear the burden of what rests upon him. And so the galaxy turns on the shoulders of one person. Then Palpatine and Windu scene happens, which is among my favorite scenes in this movie. I'd say probably my 4th favorite. It's a damn good scene. Pretty much from this point on is just amazingness, with one notable exception. Palpatine mutates his face intentionally, and his face... Well, let's rewind a bit here. Mace Windu is left alive, and I'm going to say it that way because I have literally no doubt that Palpatine could crush Windu like a bug if he wanted to, especially because Windu walked in there with typical Jedi arrogance. Absolute belief that he and the other Jedi Knights and Masters with him would have no problem bringing down one Sith Lord. And then Palpatine obliterates all of them except for Windu in seconds. But he leaves Windu alive. Now, Windu, of course, is partially responsible for that. But I have absolutely no doubt, especially given the book, that Palpatine deliberately left Windu alive because he needed him. Windu's survival was critical to Palpatine's plan, and so Palpatine played with him until he sensed Anakin was near. One of the things I've talked about extensively in my lore runs especially is the power of the moment. Most people, and I was arguing this when it came to StarCraft 2, most people will look at a moment and say, well, of course they're going to choose blah. There's no tension there. There's no choice. Logically, it would be that. But the problem with that thought process is that is basically a fallacy. That is you being an armchair general. And I mean no insult by this, because I've done this too. In other words, here, in my chair, hence the term armchair general, with advantages of hindsight and knowledge of the situation that the person doesn't have, no emotional attachment, no connection, and I don't have to make a decision in the next half second, I can decide and think on the matter and say, well, this is the correct decision. But in the moment we do things that aren't even logical to ourselves. We as human beings will do things, and in the moment, and we'll look back at it and say, that doesn't even make sense. Not even to us. We did that, and it makes no sense to us. We will do things in the moment we will regret for the rest of our lives. We will do things in the moment that are not even sensical, even in the moment, and then we flail and try to fix the situation, and that just makes things worse. The heat of the moment is something that is hard to underestimate for a human being, for a sentient being. This is true in real life just as it is in fiction. And Palpatine knows this. And so he manipulates this scene perfectly. He lets Windu defeat him, doesn't actually try to kill him, lets him be pushed back, so it's just Windu and him. And so Anakin shows up and sees Palpatine cowering before Windu. And the whole time, Palpatine maintains his facade with 2 tiny exceptions. He's there. He's like, oh God, no, no, I'm powerless. Help me, please, God, help. Oh, I can't do it. I'm too weak. And he's got this look of shock and fear and horror. And oh my God, Windu's about to kill me. Meanwhile, Windu is standing there like this demon from hell who's got rage played out all over his face as the dark side is powering through him because Windu is close to the dark side and has his own things about that, blah blah blah. And so he's like, oh, I must destroy you. Think about how that scene looked to Anakin. Palpatine knew that Windu attacking Palpatine would not be enough to cause Anakin to be prodded into action. He needed it to be so one-sided that it was obvious that in the moment Anakin would do something he would not normally do, and attack Windu. And so he cowered and pushed Windu to the point where Windu would not accept his surrender, where Windu would logically dictate that Palpatine needed to die. And here's the beautifully wonderful part. It's true! Windu was right. Palpatine needed to die. Palpatine had to be destroyed. Picture for a moment, though, the significance of that choice. I don't think Windu went into that blindly. Windu, especially given the books fleshing out his character, Windu knew that killing Palpatine would damn the Jedi. The Jedi would be heralded as the assassins of the Chancellor. And Yoda and Windu were both talking about the fact that they would have to take control of the Senate temporarily. Think how that would look. Think how the galaxy would have, or at the very least the people, the locals, think about how bad that could have gone, politically, personally, in terms of perception. Think about the Jedi being viewed as conquerors and tyrants as a result of these actions. Or indeed hunted down as a result of these actions. Vilified, hated. But he still made the choice because, in his opinion, that sacrifice was still worth it to remove the last Sith Lord. It is debatable whether or not that it was the correct choice, because we will never know. The symmetry of this scene is beautiful, because it harkens back to Anakin's own choice to kill Dooku. Not to let him be brought in, not to let him be justice done to him, or proper jurisdiction or surrendering or anything like that, which is what the original plan was from Dooku's perspective, by the way. Dooku always planned to be brought in and have this farce trial go on and blah, 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 blah. Have Palpatine use his manipulations to free him, etc., etc. But no. Anakin killed him, and that was the correct choice, debatably. And now Anakin is the one arguing, you can't do this. You can't kill him. The difference here being that now Anakin is driven by his own personal feelings. His fear and his desperation to not only because of the situation and his lack of understanding of the Jedi, who he has disagreed with fervently on many occasions, but his need to save Padme. The only thing that ruins this scene is the fact that they make Palpatine look really gross and ugly there. I'll talk about that in just a moment. I mentioned one other thing, though. Some people have actually argued with me that Palpatine was genuinely helpless there, which I disagree with for 3 reasons. Number 1, Palpatine. And I'm just going to say that. Not just in the extended universe, but even in the movies, he is portrayed as Palpatine. Moving on. Point 2. There's one tiny little tidbit where he gets this little look on his face as he's looking over at Anakin. And it's the only time he doesn't portray himself as helpless before Windu. He's just like, tiny little tidbit, but worth noting. And point 3, as soon as Windu is disarmed, pun intended, Palpatine crushes him like a bug. I do the unlimited power quote, but I know you guys hate it when I yell. And I can only do that at full volume, so forgive me. Unlimited power. Anyways, the face of Palpatine and the voice of Palpatine. One thing they actually did well. He looks terrible. I don't like that. I wish they had just left him looking the way he did. I actually think Palpatine looked better and more intimidating as the kindly, as the way Ian McDiarmid looked with his makeup job than as, But one thing they did beautifully was they altered his voice, which does 2 awesome things. One, it shows that he has actually been physically damaged by the experience. He is actually literally losing his voice to an extent. It gets better later, but in the moment he is still damaged, and it shows in the way he talks, which is really well done. The other thing is the way his voice is modulated makes it sound just a little bit like Vader eventually would, which is also awesome. One other thing that the book goes into significant detail on, and the movies touch on briefly, is Palpatine does something. I don't know how many other Sith or Jedi in general have ever done this, but he actually pulls Anakin's Sith name from the Force directly. He reaches out and just feels the correctness of the name, and then he dubs him Vader. Lord Vader. I just like that. I could talk about the significance of Sith names and their usage in general, but I'm not going to bore you with that. One interesting thing, two things Palpatine does here in the following scene. One, he specifically singles out Obi-Wan as a traitor. Of course he does. He still knows Obi-Wan is the one thing that is still a risk to his plans, and the one individual who probably has a chance at turning Anakin at all. The second thing he does is he continues telling the truth. If we let the Jedi live, we risk a civil war. That is true. If we let the Jedi live, they will come and kill us both, or at least try. Still true. Interesting, isn't it, when you think about it? His continued usage of truth to gain his ends is another wonderful hallmark of Palpatine's, shall we say, manipulative style. Anakin's face when he purges the temple is horrifying. Again, Hayden Christensen, facial acting. Look at his face as he... Well, I mentioned earlier that it requires a disciplined mind to use the dark side as extensively as Palpatine does. The reason why is the dark side and the light side both feed on themselves. The more you are passive, the more you become passive. The more you are aggressive, the more you become aggressive. And it takes discipline and self-control to maintain yourself and not be influenced by the force that is influencing you. Anakin lacks that discipline and self-control, and it explains why, after his wobbly advancement here throughout the Force, when he hits the dark side, he plummets. Because it feeds on itself over and over and over. And remember what I said back in Episode 2, and is especially emphasized throughout Episode 3, Anakin does not have that kind of self-control. He has some discipline, he has some growth as a character. He has turned into someone who is actually a person now. But he does not have the discipline to control himself. And so when he starts using the dark side and it keeps going and going and feeding, and someone with as much raw power as Anakin calls so much of the dark side that it corrupts him so quickly and so severely that within the space of a few days he's not even the same person anymore. By the way, one funny little note. At no point in time does Palpatine say, "Go kill the children." This is indicative of two very wonderful things. Horrible, but wonderful things. Number one, he didn't have to say that. He wanted Anakin to come to that conclusion himself. And number two, Anakin did come to that conclusion himself. Anakin decided coldly, brutally, that those children would someday be threats if they were left alive, and so he cut them down. And another great thing they do, a lot of times when they show the deaths of the Jedi, the purging that happens, and I'm talking about this in a moment, the directing style is beautiful. They don't show the gore. They don't show the violence. Half the time they don't even show the death. They don't have to. They show just enough so you understand, so your mind knows what's happening. My favorite shot of this is when the shot rises onto one of the Jedi who has fallen, and they're still shooting her corpse. And as it goes up, pieces of the foliage come out and cover where her corpse would be. And they're still shooting into that spot as we continue to watch that. I actually cried during Order 66. Because the Jedi Council and the Jedi as a whole, for all their foolishness and stupidity and dogma, are snuffed out without hope or chance of survival. One by one, Yoda feels lights blinking out across the whole of the galaxy. It's hard not to feel what that would be like. The music, the directing of the scenes, all of it is right in your face as you understand this is the moment the galaxy died. As everything descended into a darkness that would last for decades. Even Yoda had a minute at most, seconds, in order to adapt, to understand what was happening. And even Yoda still almost didn't survive this incident. It is also worth noting that Yoda is, of course, the one who survives. I'm not just talking about the original trilogy. Even the Yoda we have seen in the three prequels is someone who would survive this ambush. But no one else. Except Obi-Wan. And Obi-Wan got lucky and nothing else. How's that for funny? Then Senator Organa starts to finally take the forefront. He was back in episode 2. I didn't even mention him like at all because there was nothing worth mentioning. And there's a few deleted scenes about him, and I believe Mon Mothma was there too. I could be wrong. I haven't actually watched the deleted scenes in a while. They weren't on my copy I just watched. But as they basically organize the list of whatever, the list of 500 I think it was, the senators who are in opposition to Palpatine, and most of them die, and the various senators who... They're burgeoning rebellion, basically. The very beginning embers of what will eventually become the Rebel Alliance are shown. It's awesome, but it's also awesome because Organa is really shown as a man of action. And that's good because not only does it really emphasize the kind of character he is and makes him more awesome, especially since we already knew that from the books, but it kind of shows one of the reasons why Leia would become the woman she is, or was, or whatever. Because she is raised by a man like that, someone who is willing enough and has enough sense of duty and responsibility to openly support Emperor Palpatine, but this will and drive necessary to try and do everything he can to subvert him at the same time. I have a few notes here right at the end. Is this it? Oh no, I've got one more page. Of course I do. I also like Anakin's quiet hope for Obi-Wan. Remember, Palpatine specifically singled him out, but even now, Anakin specifically mentions, it is my hope that, Obi-Wan is still loyal to the Chancellor. And you can hear in his voice and in his expression that he doesn't want to kill Obi-Wan. He doesn't want to purge him like he has the others. He still hopes that the one Jedi he actually cares about and feels like is a decent person, the one person of 3 that he trusts, is still that person. It's also probably indicative because he hasn't drunk in enough of the dark side at this point in time to be truly lost. We'll get to that in a moment. And then Obi-Wan and Yoda, who link up after this, have an immediate understanding of the severity of the situation. And I like that. It shows their intelligence and their grasp, but their wisdom. Both of them realize they are staring at the possible end of the Jedi. Not just the Order, but the Jedi as a concept, the ability... I mean, they both know, or at least if they thought about it in hindsight, that in the future Jedi would be born. New people with Force powers would be born, and, the possibility of light side would return. But they also both know that the Jedi Order would be purged from memory, from history, from the databanks, so that none of their teachings or wisdom or understanding would survive. And the irony is we know this, because we know that by the time the original trilogy comes around and by the time the extended universe takes off, basically Thrawn trilogy and onwards, that Luke, when he's trying to reestablish the Jedi Order, has basically nothing to go off of the old, because it was purged. Although that's a good thing, in my opinion, but it's just worth note. And then we have 2 beautiful scenes. Lots of beautiful scenes, actually. Anakin goes and starts butchering people who are helpless. Now I know what you're going to say. They are enemies of the state. They are villains. They are people who are not exactly good people. They are on the opposite side. They are literally enemies in a war. I also feel like pointing out these are enemies who are helpless and have surrendered and are willing to end the war and want to end the war. Think about the fact that Anakin just goes through there butchering them. The shot of his eyes, when his eyes start to turn yellow from influence of the darkness, I'm sorry, the dark side, Kingdom Hearts joke, is very significant. Because this is when he finally goes past the point of no return, in my opinion. Again, he is drinking in the dark side, and he is using so much of it because he himself is so powerful that it is destroying him at an incredible rate. For him to manifest that kind of visual, literal, physical corruption in such an incredibly short period of time, he is drowning in the dark side. And it makes what happens next make much more sense. And then there's my favorite line in the entire movie. I actually put it down there on the quote. "So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause." Padme has always had a unique and keen mind and an understanding of the situations around her. That's been shown even all the way back to Episode 1, and especially in the books. But here we show that has never stopped. She still understands just how bad things have just become and how much worse things are going to get. And then there's the scene where Obi-Wan talks to Padme. It's funny because it mirrors the earlier thing I talked about, where Anakin hopes that Obi-Wan is redeemable, in that Obi-Wan hopes Anakin is redeemable. At no point does he say, I'm going to kill him. At no point does he say, I'm going to destroy him. At no point does he say anything along those lines. He can't bring himself to admit it. He can't bring himself to confess it. He's still hiding behind the truth, behind a lack of acceptance, of realization even, of what he has to do. And his sense of duty and commitment are still pushing him forward while the rest of him is just standing there basically in shock. He has this line where he says Anakin has become a very great threat. And you can hear as he's saying that he's talking to himself. He's trying to convince himself that he must deal with Anakin, even though he does not want to, even though he's not even sure he believes that. Then Padme arrives on Mustafar, and she stops. And there's this wonderful scene where she's sitting in the thing, and she's just got her hands in her heads, and the enormity of what she's about to face is overwhelming her. She's actually crying, too. Because think about it, this is a woman who wants nothing more. This is a woman who just watched the Republic die. The Galactic Republic just died, literally. There's no, exaggeration here. The Empire was just born. She was present and signed the treaty, the legal documents that formed the Empire. She knows that her republic and her way of life are gone. And she sits here knowing and thinking and worrying and fearing that it might be Anakin, that he's a part of this. And she doesn't want to believe it, but she is afraid that it is true. And she can't bring herself to just leave immediately to go face him because she is so terrified of that being the truth. And then there's a wonderfully horrible moment when he sees her and he starts jogging after her as he realizes it's her. It's horrible because this is an Anakin who has literally been bathing in the dark side. And yet he sees her, and in that jog and the way he moves it, this acting is not just vocal, right? Acting is your body, your movements. The way he's doing it, it's obvious. He's like, oh my god, it's Padme. There's joy there. There's enthusiasm. It's like, yes, this is great. And then they'd start talking. And he starts admitting the truth of the pragmatism of his actions, and she is horrified by it. And she keeps saying all the wrong things, which just feed into his anger, because he is already so angry, so burning from the dark side, that it only takes the tiniest little spark in order to set off a conflagration. He is so gone at this point. The irony is, I always felt like his trust in her led him to this decision. His trust in her led him to the realization that he could be the enforcer to make sure the galaxy is a peaceful, wonderful place, because he's good at it. He's good at being a soldier. He's good at being a general. He's proved this throughout the Clone Wars. And he has that personal power. And he trusts her to rule, to lead. He actually tells her, we will rule the galaxy together. You will be able to do all the things you know are right. And he says it as if that's something she should be overjoyed at. And it shows his total lack of understanding of her perspective, that she never wanted that power. That she took up her duties as a queen, as a senator, because it was her duty, because of her discipline, because of her desire to accomplish that which she believed was good, even though she didn't want to. Offering her the power of a galaxy on a plate is not something she ever wanted. And she is telling him right there, let's just go, just be with me. She was even willing to forgive all he'd done if he had just abandoned it all in that moment. And yet, and the book makes this so beautifully clear, in the moment, he has done so much for her. He has sacrificed his honor, his dignity, his sense of moral compass. He has turned to the dark side. He has killed people. He has done all of these things for her. But in the moment, when it should have all been about her, he was only thinking about himself. He was so drowned in the dark side that all of it was internal. internally focused, internally structured. Peace, prosperity, and order to my new empire. And then he kills her. Now, I know she doesn't die for some time after, but the books and the extended works, and indeed Lucas himself off camera has all admitted she died because he crushed her with the Force so severely that it never stopped hurting her, basically. It never stopped killing her. She didn't lose the will to live or whatever. She died because he basically poisoned her with his ridiculous amount of dark side hatred and virulent rage and jealousy and self-interest. And then Obi-Wan says something which has been pointed out many, many, many times. Only a Sith deals in absolutes. The phrase itself being an absolute. I mentioned earlier Yoda's failure. This is Obi-Wan's failure. In the one moment when he should have approached his friend, his Padawan, as an equal and as an ally, as a friend and as a brother, he should have reached to him and been honest about his own passions, his own emotions, his own feelings, and Anakin's own, and tried to establish a genuine diplomacy and dialogue. Obi-Wan, in the moment, shocked and horrified at all he has learned, leans back on those same Jedi teachings which have already failed so many times. Obi-Wan himself reverts to dogma as his only mental and emotional recourse to cope with the horror of having to kill his own brother, rather than considering the possibility of trying to salvage him. Is it possible Anakin was salvageable here? Debatable. But there is no denying that this was the true completion of Obi-Wan's failure. I'm not sure if this is true or not. I have often said that the difference between the duels in Empire Strikes Back and Phantom Menace is the best way to shine a spotlight on the difference in approach to the two trilogies. Empire Strikes Back's duel between Vader and Luke was amazing. It was all about the scene, the moment, the emotion, the tragedy, Vader basically playing with him, and yet Luke actually managing to damage him in return, which showed, well, lots of things I'm going to go into later. It was an amazing, amazing duel, and it was all about the people. It was the duel itself was basically just window dressing for, well, not even window dressing, it was just a representation, a symbology of all that was going on between the characters. By contrast, Darth Maul facing Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan was cool, but as I mentioned back in Episode 1, had many flaws. I'm not going to repeat myself. Just go watch my Episode 1 video. I don't know if this is true, but having rewatched it again, it is debatable as if the best Jedi duel in the movie's history is actually this one. Anakin Skywalker versus Obi-Wan Kenobi. Because it's all there. The music is incredible. What is it? The Fate of Heroes, Duel of Heroes, something like that. It's amazing music. John Williams just blew me out of the water with the music. But the sound design and the symmetry of the two fighting and the choreography, I told you I'd mention this later. These are two people who have had such incredible coordination. I mentioned this earlier. They fight like they're one unit. And now they're fighting each other. And everything they do is perfectly balanced and matched to each other. They are always constantly matching each other in such a perfect and in absolute way. It's actually kind of beautiful in an almost artistic, mathematical perspective. And the choreography for these scenes shows it. They spent so much time on this duel. You have no idea how much time they spent on this duel. I've seen Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen practicing about 2 seconds of a particular move, and then pausing, and then stretching, and then doing the same 2 seconds. They actually did so much work to make this exactly what it should have been. Because all of that is also significant. This is all just the symbology, but again, just like Empire, there's more under that. This isn't just two people fighting. This is two brothers who have grown so close to each other as to be closer to each other than basically either of them are to anyone else. Really. And this is one of the reasons I say they have that amazing chemistry and why they are so close, why they are blood brothers. You follow? Because these two men have shared more than they have with anyone else. Even Padme, even Palpatine, even Obi-Wan and his connections to the Council. None of that means anything compared to how close these two people are to each other. The strength of that bond, being twisted in such a horrible way as to fight each other, is that wonderful, incredible symbology of what the dark side and the light side can do, of the false dichotomy of the light side and the dark side, of the fact that that's what war can do to someone, of the fact that it doesn't take much for an individual to decide to do something else, of the significance of what can happen when two characters choose different paths and then those paths happen to recoincide in negative consequences, and of course in the fact that both of them don't actually want to be doing this. At no point in time throughout the whole fight, right up until the end, do either of them feel like someone who genuinely wants to hurt or kill the other. Even Anakin, in all his funneling of the dark side, clearly does not actually want to be doing this any more than Obi-Wan does. And they just fight, and it never gets old, and it never gets tiring. And the whole time I actually was on this edge of my seat. I admit it. I am not ashamed. I was like, oh my god, I know how this fight ends. But it was so gripping. Not just from design perspective and construction perspective like Episode 1's was, but from the pathos and the significance and the symbology like Episode 7's, or no, 5's. Episode 5's was. Sorry. 5 and 7 mix up in my head. Just the numbers in general. I was, oh my god. And then we are splicing this back and forth between my other favorite duel of all time. But this is just so beautiful. Palpatine versus Yoda. Two great Jedi masters, Inquisitors by class, both using the Force more commonly than their skill with blades. Both amazingly powerful, both old, both wise, both skilled, both disciplined. But the reason I love the duel between Palpatine and Yoda, again, isn't just because it looks awesome. And it does. It looks amazing. But the symbology and the surface underneath these two, again, is brilliant, is so character-driven. Palpatine, the Sith Lord, the Grey Jedi, who adapted, who grew, who learned, who became stronger, who tried to do things better and more, both in subtlety and in discipline and in skill and in power. He is someone who has become the perfect individual to take over the galaxy. He has been growing since the last time the Sith and the Jedi have fought, which was many, many, many years ago. Yoda? Yoda has been stagnant. Yoda, the book says this perfectly. Yoda has spent all his long years preparing and training the Jedi for the day the Sith may return to fight the last war they fought against the Sith. But the Sith, as personified in Palpatine, well, they're fighting this war. Watch the fight again. Honestly, I encourage you. It's a great scene. Yoda is struggling, straining, just barely keeping up. Yoda is doing everything he can to keep up, and Palpatine is laughing. Remember I mentioned all the way back in Episode 1 the sheer joy Maul was experiencing at finally being able to unleash his powers? All of that is exemplified 10 times fold in Palpatine, who is just recklessly and with wanton abandon finally unleashing all of his power on Yoda because he doesn't have to hold back at all ever again. He can finally unleash all that he is. And he does. And it is glorious to watch. But the real irony of this is where Yoda realizes his failure. Yoda has always been someone, I mentioned this in Episode 2 as very important. Yoda is someone who, remember when he took up the walking stick? That's what I'm referring to, right? He takes up the walking stick. I'm sorry, give me 1 second. Something from my little niece. He takes up the walking stick, and it was indicative of Yoda's perspective. He was the person who was very controlled, very restrained, keep himself under the surface, but when the moment called for it, Yoda would pull upon all his powers, right? Just like he did with Dooku. Well, that's what happens here. He's been restrained and quiet and self-contained, and then he fights Palpatine, and he brings forth all his powers, And then somewhere along the line in the fight, Yoda realizes it's not enough. Think about what that's like to realize that. To be confident and self-assured and arrogant without even realizing it. Arrogance without realization of, I can do this because all I have to do is try my hardest. And then trying your hardest, and you're nothing. You're pale. You cannot keep up. That realization, as Yoda in the book, it's like my favorite scene in all of the movie, or rather the book of Revenge of the Sith, as Yoda realizes and truly comes to understand the gravitas of his failure, of the failure of the Order. And he flees and tries to get away, and there's this line, I wish this was still in the movie. It's a line that Organa asks him. He looks at Yoda, who is just, oh my god, and Organa asks him, are you hurt? And Yoda's response is, only my pride. Because Yoda understands just how badly he screwed up. It makes his exile make much more sense, doesn't it? It's kind of a shame. Obi-Wan finally does defeat Anakin. It's been debated whether he should have or not. It doesn't matter. He defeats him. And it's significant because he finally defeats him, chops off his legs. And only in that moment does he allow himself to finally actually express his emotions and feelings that he should have before the fight even began. You were my brother, Anakin. I loved you. And in the moment, he can't bring himself to do it. When it was fighting, when it was intense and vigorous, and oh my god, at any moment, if I lose my discipline and control, I might die. But when all that has passed, in the moment, he is now staring at his defeated and dismembered enemy, and he can't bring himself to kill him. He can't do it. He can't bring himself to kill his brother. And so he leaves in sorrow and grief and distress. Anakin, lying there on the hot rock, literally being burned alive, in horrifying pain, must have been the biggest beacon of the dark side that has ever been in the history of this entire setting, as all that pain fed out into his power, which was maintaining his life just enough to make him feel more pain, and this horrible, horrible loop. Some people have argued that that's the moment Darth Vader was truly born, as he laid there on Mustafar, screaming. Because that much dark side power sustaining him and feeding his pain, which kept the cycle going. We here in real life don't even have the Force, and yet if we were in that kind of pain, it could still break a mind. I should know. But it's also interesting that it's up to interpretation whether or not Palpatine cared about Anakin. And I mention that because it was deliberately left up to interpretation in the movies and the book. There is enough evidence that he did, and enough evidence that he thought of Anakin as just another tool. I personally think that that he did care about Anakin. That the one person Palpatine actually cared about as a person, rather than a tool, was Anakin. That he was in such a hurry, such a haste to save Anakin's life was not just because he wanted to preserve his apprentice, because he certainly did, but because deep underground there, whether Palpatine was even willing to admit it to himself or not, he wanted to save his friend. Remember, he had been honest with Anakin for so many years, truthful with him about so many things, and had engendered a genuine relationship and familial caring between them. It is not that out of bounds, I think, to show that the one person that actually managed to break through the icy exterior of Emperor Palpatine was Anakin Skywalker. Again, that idea of symmetry. This movie does it really well in many ways. Vader is taken to the brand new medical facility, the one I mentioned in brief earlier, the one that had basically just been built with all this experimental technology about cyber organisms. While Padme is taken to the Organa facility on that meteor or asteroid, whatever it is, base. And Luke and Leia are born as Anakin Skywalker dies. And then Vader takes his first breath. I'm sorry, forgive me for geeking out. But even now, that gave me chills. Hearing that breath. That first. And in that moment, when Darth Vader truly was born, I actually counted, it's 21 seconds from Vader taking his first breath to Padme taking her last. And Padme's final words are so, again, appropriately perfect. There is still good in him. Wow, I'm actually tearing up. Because there was. She was right. Luke proved that, damn it. Luke proved his mother right. It took him years to show that there was still Anakin Skywalker somewhere amidst all of that mess. It's really appropriate that they have funeral music playing, not just because Padme is dying, but because Vader is being born. Funeral music being played for the Darth Vader, the suit, the man in the suit becoming alive, is so wonderfully dramatically appropriate, I can't even put words into it. One other thing that's touched on in the books a lot, and in all ancillary works, is that Anakin Skywalker was the most powerful individual in the Force in terms of raw power ever, right? But because of how badly damaged he was, physically and mentally and emotionally by Mustafar, his connection to the Force was basically wrong. He was literally injured. I mean, I know what you're saying. Of course he is. He needs a suit to live, but you don't understand. His connection to the Force was injured, just as he was. And so his ability to use the Force was greatly diminished. Which is significant for two huge things. One, it explains one of the reasons why Palpatine was willing, decades later, to abandon Vader in place of a new apprentice. But number two, it really emphasizes just how ridiculously strong Anakin was in the Force. Because Vader is ridiculously strong in the Force. And they show this not just in the movies, of course, but they show this all over the place. And then he says no. I'm imagining some of you were waiting up this. I mentioned a while ago, from a certain point on, the movie is just flawless and perfect. All I can do is gush. I'm sitting here watching this movie on the edge of my seat in tears. Oh my god. And then he goes, no! And it ruins everything. It killed the mood so badly I actually started laughing. Isn't it ironic, too, because it would only take a tiny change to make that fit. Instead of screaming something so stupid, just have him roar. Just scream. In pain, in fear, in rage. Wouldn't that have been much more appropriate? I have nothing else to add about this movie. I like Episode 3. That should be obvious. And the fact that the movie ends on the view of the twin sunsets on Tatooine is wonderfully appropriate. And the fact that the movie ends where the next movie begins is also wonderfully appropriate. Quick note, it may be a pause thanks to real-life time concerns before the next episode comes out, Episode 4, but I really hope you're going to join me for it, and I hope you have enjoyed my ruminations on the prequel trilogy. I will see you guys on the other side.